The 48-hour contest period of the new Root of Nightmares raid is now officially over. And over those past 48 hours, and even afterwards, there has been a ton of talk surrounding the difficulty of the event itself. Given that I am both a player that likes to participate in these endgame activities, I participate in the world's first race, and a player who does everything in his power to help other players participate in these activities, making guide videos, or even in some circumstances, helping out people directly. I wanted to give my thoughts on the entire event, the difficulty of it, all that stuff. If you don't care about my opinion, this video probably won't interest you very much. But if you do, then enjoy. Starting with the raid itself, visually, I feel like we say this every single time, but probably visually the best raid we've ever had. I think Bungie really leveled up the pyramid aesthetic. Remember, Vow of the Disciple was also in a pyramid, similar to Root of Nightmares, but Vow of the Disciple, I think, looked really, really good off in the distance. I think its overall environment was incredible. However, it didn't really have anything close up to kind of wow you. It had a couple weird statues and stuff like that, but the main attractions of Vow of the Disciple were the worm god out in the distance, the Rhulk cube, and just the general expansiveness of the environment. I think Root of Nightmares not only did the long range environment better, but also made a beautiful close up visual splendor masterpiece. You've got the Traveler up in the sky. You've got the Tree of Silver Wings off in the distance. You can see pretty much the entire raid just from walking in. Visually, it's just amazing. Close up, you're running on the vines. You feel like you're actually experiencing the environment. You've got this iridescent color palette. You've got this botanical theme. I think it's really, really, really solid. As far as the gameplay itself goes, first encounter I thought was really, really good. I think it did a great job of introducing the base mechanic. I think it was the perfect difficulty, regardless of whether or not you're an endgame player or a brand new player. I think first encounter here is the baseline of what a first encounter in any raid should be. I think the base mechanic is pretty simple, but I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. I liked it a lot. Second encounter, I think advanced the mechanic in an interesting and meaningful way. Not only did it introduce a new color of the mechanic so that you kind of had two versions of the mechanic going on at the same time, but it also forced you to cross sides of the chasm so that the different colors were kind of having to interact with each other. The dark had to go over to what was originally the light side and vice versa. I thought it was really neat. The problem I have is that the main mechanic, or the main method for executing the main mechanic, the thrusters or the jump pads or the push, whatever you want to call them, are completely broken. They don't they don't work at all. They seemingly only ever throw you too short or too high up. And I think if you're going to have a main mechanic in an encounter, I think it's got to work properly. I hope this doesn't turn into another duality where we're just kind of forced to deal with it and figure it out the way that we had to deal with the bells randomly killing you. But definitely frustrating when you're actually playing this encounter. A funny thing I saw people talking about after a good amount of teams clear this encounter is that this encounter was the very reason, or that the thruster pads, the push pads themselves, are the very reason that Bungie removed momentum-based damage or momentum-based deaths. And I think that is 100% true. Because if they didn't remove that, I don't think anyone would have been able to beat this encounter in any capacity. After the second encounter, we had, it's not really a new encounter, but the intermission between second and third, the long walk, the flawless run killer is what I'm going to call it right now. This troubles me a great deal. And we'll talk a bit more about why this troubles me so much when we get to the Nezarec conversation. But all I'm going to say right now is I think this mechanic that we learned in the walk between second and third should have instead been introduced in the second encounter, the previous encounter of the raid with the thrusters. We'll talk about more when I get to fourth, but that's that. The third encounter, the macrocosm, I believe it's called, highlight of the raid for me personally. I think first and foremost, the setting, this planetarium theme, incredible, because for those who didn't notice, this is the room that we were introduced to the Witness as a character in. The end of the Witch Queen campaign, after you kill Savathun, you see the final cutscene at her body, and her ghost, Amaru, I think is the name, runs away. We get the cutscene, this mysterious figure, the cloak running around, no pieces left to play, Pale Heart holds the key, blah, 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 whatever. Who is this guy? Looks like Megamind. Never seen something like that in Destiny. Revealed the Witness. The room that the Witness is in that cutscene, that's the third encounter. It's the planetarium. That's it. I think that's awesome from like a lore perspective, environmental perspective, whatever you want to call it. I think it's so cool. And the mechanics itself, I actually enjoyed a lot. I thought the way the room flowed was really, really solid. I thought the getting into DPS phase was a cool idea. I love the idea of moving the planets around. I thought it was awesome. That being said, these mechanics felt super out of place for this raid, which is really weird. Remember, we just spent the last two encounters getting taught about the seeds and the nodes and the field of light buff and the flux of darkness buff. It just did all that. And now we're in this planet encounter, which seemingly has absolutely nothing to do with everything we just learned, which I think would be kind of okay if we got to the fourth encounter, and then the fourth encounter was simply an extension of the mechanics we learned in the third encounter. However, that's obviously not the case. You learn mechanics in the first encounter, they're reinforced in the second, you forget them all and learn new ones in the third, and then you forget everything in the third and go back to the mechanics you learned in the first and second encounter when you get back to Rhulk, or Nezarec, sorry. We'll talk about Rhulk in a sec. I think it's kind of weird. I don't think it objectively makes the encounter bad. Something worth noting. It feels like this encounter was pulled from a different raid. It feels like it was meant for something else. But it plays amazing, so I don't know if I can really complain about it. And one issue I had with this encounter was I feel like it lacked a little bit of visual clarity. I think you're taught throughout the entire encounter that the entire premise is every planet has a little interactable underneath it, and you interact with the planets on an individual basis to move them around to match them up. And then once you match them up, the idea is that the platforms that they're on, they're imbued with all the light energy from the three planets, or all the dark energy from the three planets. And then that empowers the platforms, and then you can take all that combined energy to the DPS plates. That's what allows you to do damage. However, when you're supposed to take that energy to the DPS plates, you're still pulling the node from just one of the three individual planets. I think what would have been a lot better is if instead, once you match the three planets on the plate, instead of having a node under each individual planet, have one node in the direct center of the plate on top of the little spike that's sticking out of it. I think it would have made a lot more sense and would have helped teams understand the mechanics a lot better. And I think it would have kind of closed the loop on the logic puzzle that encounter is trying to put on display. Again, it's my one small nitpick. Everything else about that encounter I thought was absolutely incredible. Actually, sorry, one more thing. If the Colossuses, or Colossi, whatever you call them, if you're shooting them and they fall off the platform, you don't get the buff. And they don't come back up, and they don't respawn. And so you just have to do another. I think that's super annoying. I think if they fall off, you should get the buff. That's my only other nitpick. Hopefully they fix that, but we'll see. Fourth encounter. I think the fourth encounter was really cool. I loved the fast-paced nature of the fourth encounter. I think it really aligned with the philosophy of Nezarec, his lore, his attitude. I loved that it was crazy, chaotic, and the idea was you're moving as fast as you can, lightning speed, while he's running around the arena like a mad dog hunting people down. Really cool energy. That being said, The mechanics here felt really simple for a final boss encounter. I don't think the phases going fast is necessarily an issue, but I think them being mechanically underwhelming and that you really only have 2 people doing stuff while the other 4 are ad clearing / shooting his chest feels kind of weird. I feel like there was room for a new mechanic here. There kind of was a new mechanic, though, I guess. I wouldn't call it new, but it probably felt new to a lot of people. Because the mechanic that you learned in between the second and third encounter, the refuge mechanic, for those who don't really get how it works, if you obtain the field of light or the flux of darkness, field of darkness buff, whatever, if you have the buff and you shoot the opposite color seed with it, it will create a refuge of that seed at that point that makes you immune to the blasts of that element. You only had to be immune to the darkness blasts, so you were only creating darkness refuges. You would get the light buff, go to the dark seed, shoot the dark seed, make a darkness refuge, and then you're immune to the darkness blast. That's the mechanic. This mechanic was supposed to be used in Nezarec. I'm pretty sure every phase is what Bungie's design intention was. What you were supposed to do is, if you shoot Nezarec's chest, you pull the hatred buff off of everyone so that they don't get knocked up and they can keep doing their thing. His shoulders were glowing too, though. And if you shot his shoulders, he would explode and reveal a color. He would do the whitish blue light color or the orange dark color. Whatever color he blew up, that's what indicated what his white mechanic burst was going to be. And so the idea was that you were supposed to set up refuges early on in the Nezarec encounter before you did your runs of your flowers. And then you shoot the shoulders, blow them up, see the color, go stand on that refuge to avoid the white mechanic, and then go back to your business and finish off the rest of the flowers. However, the issue was that the game gave you enough time to theoretically brute force and do all 6 flowers on each side before the white mechanic even ever happened, if you were fast enough. And I think in a day 1 context, or a contest mode context, or whatever you want to call it, this is incredibly frustrating because what happens is, if the encounter is beatable, if you're allowed to get to DPS phase without hitting his white mechanic, or his white mechanic just barely gets you as you're getting towards the end, it doesn't really give the impression that the white mechanic is supposed to be avoidable. It instead gives the impression that, oh, he just barely wiped us as I was running to the final flower. That simply means I didn't do it fast enough. So people weren't really looking for a way to avoid his white mechanic. 1, because they just figured the whole idea of the encounter was to go super fast. And 2, because the mechanic that we were taught to use to avoid this white mechanic was not taught to us in an actual encounter. It was taught to us in an intermission jumping puzzle phase, which makes it so incredibly forgettable. Now, if you teach that mechanic in the intermission phase before you get to Nezarec, in between the 3rd and the 4th encounter, then maybe that works because it's fresh in your mind. But they taught it before the 3rd encounter. So they taught the refuge mechanic, and then you go to 3rd encounter and forget every mechanic you've learned so far in the entire raid and learn a whole new set of mechanics. And then you go back to Nezarec and you forget all the 3rd encounter mechanics, but you're not going to remember the stuff from this little intermission phase. I think would have been much better is if Bungie found a way to integrate the refuge mechanic into the 2nd encounter itself. I think it would have gone a long way for kind of sticking that mechanic in the player's mind of like, oh, wait a minute, we can create safety points that will protect us from these darkness and light blasts. I think it would have helped a lot. The DPS phase of Nezarec, I think, also had issues. I think Bungie tried to do another Rhulk. Another melee dude that runs around. And I like that they're still trying to go into this idea of bosses that don't stand still. Bosses that don't just sit there while you laser them. I think that's good that we're trying to get away from that. And I think Rhulk was perfection in that manner. I think Nezarec, however, is a failed attempt at trying to do that. The reason Rhulk works so well is because it's fair and it's unavoidable. His DPS phase is on a flat platform with no escape and no cover whatsoever. You are stuck on there with him. You have to deal with his attacks. You do not have a choice. However, all of his attacks are fair. He tells you where he's going. He tells you where he's shooting. It's telegraphed. You get ample warning. It's just a skill check. And it works beautifully. Nezarec, on the other hand, suffers from bad arena design in relation to his DPS phase specifically, because you can avoid every single thing that Nezarec does by simply hopping up on top of one of the seed platforms, and then he can't touch you. Because even though he's 3 times your size and can jump up a skyscraper, he can't walk up this little 2-foot platform. Which means that none of his attacks actually mean anything. Because if you're up on the platform and none of his attacks can hit you, all his attack, he could have been standing still and it would have made no difference. He's going to hit you the same amount, which kind of just makes him a boss that's standing still. A little harder to hit because he's moving around, but he doesn't pose any danger to you, which isn't super interesting. Additionally, I don't love his attacks because theoretically, if he could get up on those platforms, or if the platforms weren't there to avoid him, there's no way to avoid his attacks. I get that Bungie was trying to play into the narrative of he's crazy and he's flailing around and spinning his axe and throwing a bunch of void stuff everywhere, and he's nuts. He's lost his mind. He's, Rhulk is more calculated, hands behind the back, fighting you with his hands and fists when he has a big glaive. Nezarec, is more nuts, right? However, the attacks that he had don't translate well to an FPS game in any capacity because there's no obvious way to avoid them, no obvious way to dodge them. That the answer seemed to be kind of like, be far away, whereas the answer for Rhulk was like, this is where the attack is going, do not be in this area, which felt a lot more interesting and a lot more involved. I think a much cooler Nezarec DPS phase that could have still kind of tied to his crazy, psychopathic war god nature would have been something like, maybe you utilize the seed platforms and he's chasing you around the arena and there's like these nodes on the seed platforms and you have to do a ton of damage to the nodes and then bait Nezarec into hitting the seed, and based on how much damage you do to the seed, it blows up and does damage to him, and you use his extremely aggressive and very like feral nature against him and essentially make him hurt himself or defeat himself or something of that nature. I think that would have played a lot better. Here it just felt kind of weird getting up on a plate and being able to ignore everything. So that's my raid thoughts. Now for the actual event thoughts, the contest stuff, world's first, all that stuff. Contest difficulty, I think it's totally subjective, right? One person can say it's too easy, another person can say it's too hard, and another can say it felt just right. And none of them are wrong. It's just the way it is. Ultimately, Bungie is the one who decides how difficult this stuff is. I will say that seeing flawless runs, full 3-man runs, solo completions of the first and second encounters during the contest period, I think is kind of weird. I think that if someone is soloing one of the encounters in the new raid within 48 hours before the power cap has been lifted, I think that's probably a sign that maybe it's like a little too easy. Just a little. That being said, it is undeniable that more accessibility and difficulty tuning to a degree where more people are allowed to participate and feel like they have a chance, and complete it is a great thing. I think it's really tough to strike that balance because every time you lower that bar for entry, you lower the difficulty a little bit so that more people can have a chance. You also have to bring down the bar at the top end of how truly difficult is this really. And it's really tough to figure out how difficult do we make this activity so that the top of the line players can still enjoy it and still feel challenged by it, but also so that as many people as humanly possible can also have a shot and have a chance and enjoy this experience. I love that we saw, I think, over 270,000 individual completions, over 45,000 team completions. I think that's awesome. And I'm so happy for anyone who beat it. If you're an individual who beat it, you should be proud of yourself. Don't worry about what other people say if they said it was too easy. If someone's saying it's too easy, it's probably from their own personal, compared to their skill level. If you beat it, or even beat one of the encounters, or two, or if you got to the final boss, you should be proud of yourself. It's tough when you look at the overall populace and overall band of players that play the game. It's tough. You're definitely in the top 1%, top 5%, whatever, if you're able to get through some of this stuff. I think extending the period from 24 hours, what it originally was, to 48 hours. Originally, I was like, that seems kind of weird. For the entirety of Destiny history, it's been day one. The whole idea is you walk into the raid and, you going with your battle-hardened group. You're like, all right, y'all, we're going to beat this, no sleep. We're determined. I thought that had a degree of charm behind it that we were going to lose when we went from a day one to day two. But seeing it all play out for myself, I think the extension to a 48-hour period is nothing but fantastic. I feel like it was still intense. I feel like it still felt really, really engaging. It still felt really, really like brothers in arms type thing. I think it was great. And I think 48-hour period for all day one, or not day one raids, but all contest mode raids, new raids, I think a 48-hour period would be awesome, especially considering that Bungie has switched to releasing them on Friday now. I think all the more reason to keep that 48-hour period because obviously you have people that can't hop in right away, work, school, etc., etc. I had to take the day off work on Friday to participate in the world's first race. So not everyone is able to take the day off work. Not everyone can convince their parents to let them stay home from school. Making it 48 hours, giving people a full 24 if they start at noon on Saturday. Really great. I think that's a form of accessibility that is amazing. Doesn't hurt anyone because you don't have to lower the difficulty to give more people a chance. You're simply extending the time. I don't think it hurts anyone. That all being said, the world's first of the raids specifically, world's first was cleared in, I think, 2 hours and 27 minutes, which is really fast. I personally like world's first races to last somewhere in the 5 to 7 hour territory. I think that's the sweet spot. We will never have another Last Wish where it goes 20 plus. We'll never have that ever again. I'd be surprised if we even go double digits ever again before we hit a world's first. Double digits in the hour count, that being. But I still think 2:27 is a little short. Granted, the team that won, Hard in the Paint, they played out of their minds. Like, they killed it. Like, one of the best day one performances we've probably ever seen. But I still think 2 hours and 27 minutes. I think Scourge of the Past was 1:45, and I think that everyone agreed that felt a little too short. I feel like 2:27 isn't that far away from 1:45. I would have liked to see this at least be like 4.5, maybe 5 hours. I think it was a consequence of the mechanics being pretty simple and the DPS checks not being that difficult. But yeah, let me know in the comments. I'm curious. Like, do you, as a viewer, as someone who watches, do you wish the world's first race had lasted a little bit longer, or like does it not really? It could last 10 minutes or 10 hours and you wouldn't care either way. Let me know. I'm just curious. The final thing I want to talk about is team compositions, because this raid felt really weird to me when it came to team compositions and what classes you were supposed to bring and stuff like that. I think one of the coolest things that Bungie does with raids is there's no class requirements. You're not forced to bring, two hunters. You're not for you can go in with 6 hunters if you want to. You can go in with 3 titans, 2 world, 3, 2, 1. It's up to you completely. And I think that's really cool because it means that you get to play the class that's, you like the most, and it's not gonna inhibit your team in any major fashion. However, I think Well of Radiance really showed its head in this, and I'm not about to say that Well of Radiance needs to get nerfed. So don't raise pitchforks at me, please. But I will say that this raid, if you did it on contest, it felt like Well of Radiance was required. Not like Well of Radiance made it a lot easier for you. Like, it felt like you needed it, or you were going to have a miserable time, or this raid was going to be borderline impossible. I think that's kind of a consequence of the strength of Well of Radiance. I think Bungie is very aware I know Bungie is very aware how good it is. It's undeniable that it is the best raiding super. And if you don't believe that, go into a fire team to do a raid and say, oh, guys, we have 0 warlocks. I guarantee someone's going to immediately switch because they're going to say, oh, well, I got to switch because I'll do the well. That doesn't happen with any other class or any other super. Maybe Tether Hunter, although Tether Hunter can be replaced with a Divinity or Tractor Cannon. Don't really have that same thing for Well of Radiance. That's as easy to activate and easy to consistently spread across all 5 players without preventing the 6th from being able to shoot. Obviously you have stuff like Lumina and Titan Barricade, but that takes the player that's activating them. They can't shoot then, so you have 5 people doing DPS and says whatever. I feel like I'm getting a little scared because I think Bungie is starting to design these raids around Well of Radiance, which means that it's feeling like you are required to have X amount of warlocks in day 1, or it's just not going to be beatable. The best example for that for me is the boss encounters, obviously. In the 3rd encounter, when you stand on the DPS plates, the boss can still hit you, and he has a flamethrower. So he's going to put fire on the ground underneath you. So if you don't have a Well of Radiance, you either have to stay there so you can do DPS to him on the DPS plate and just die because you're standing on fire, or you have to leave and lose your DPS. And if you don't have a well, you're also missing out on a 20% DPS buff that happens to stack with the surge mods on boots too. So you're at a tough crossroads for that situation in particular. Nezarec as well didn't feel like well was as required because obviously you can stay on the plate and kind of avoid most of his attacks, but it still kind of felt required to prevent any external damage from any ads that you left up, or if one of his attacks does land and makes his way up onto you, or just like it feels like you're kind of starting to need it for the DPS buff. I get that people are saying that these health bars are made of paper for the contest mode, but I think that's really for endgame teams that are extremely experienced and have all the best weapons and all the best perks and have perfect damage rotations. I was watching a lot of teams do it that were barely completing the final stand, barely getting to final stand on the 3rd DPS phase. And I think without Well of Radiance, I think mathematically those teams would have not been able to kill the bosses. And, you might say, well, then they should just get better at doing DPS. And my response to that is I think it's better to instead try to create these encounters in a manner in which a certain super is not required, as opposed to just say, hey, you need to get better. Like, wouldn't it be better to allow more freedom in terms of loadout picks, because you're not forced to use the orange circle that Bungie designed the encounter around? Just a thought. Once again, I'm not saying I think it needs to get nerfed. I just wish that Bungie would find more ways to make it not the go-to or even make it required for raids. I think they already did that with Rhulk. Remember, you couldn't really use well against Rhulk because you would all stand in it and then he would walk to you and just blow it up. But obviously in Nezarec, you could stand on top of a plate and then he couldn't touch you. So I don't know if the new norm of raid bosses has to be bosses that can get to you and blow up your well, or if the new norm is just we're designing these encounters around Well of Radiance. You got to have at least 2 to 3. Deal with it. I'm curious, if you ran the raid yourself, let me know in the comments below. Let me know what encounter you got to. Let me know what your team composition was. You know, how many did you have? 3 warlocks, 2 hunters, one's, whatever, et cetera. What your class distribution was. And let me know what your experience was. Did you feel like it was too hard? Did you feel like it was too easy? Did you feel like you needed more of a certain class? Did you feel like you would not have been able to complete it if you didn't have X amount of warlocks? I'm just curious. I like knowing about this stuff. Personally for me, final thoughts, TLDW, too long didn't watch. Enjoyed the raid very much. Third counter mechanics felt really out of place, but I don't think that made it bad. Third encounter was actually my favorite one. Nezarec felt kind of weird. I think being able to avoid all of his stuff by standing on a plate was kind of odd. Well, interesting. I loved the new accessibility measures that were taken. I love that they extended it to a day 2. I thought that was amazing. I love that more people got to participate and have more time to run. However, I wish World's First specifically would have been maybe a little longer than 2.5 hours. So those are my thoughts on everything. If you made it to this point, thanks for caring about what I have to say. I'll make sure to read all the comments down below. Curious what all of you think. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a great day.